What if, in the winter of 1884, in the frost-cracked silence of rural Ohio, a farmhouse stood sealed like a coffin, its windows black with ice, its doors bolted from the inside, and within the Johnson family lay stiff in death? What curse had chained their final breath, and what shadows prowled that wooden house of hunger and silence? Before we unseal the doors of this dreadful tale, pause and let your spirit join our circle. Subscribe and step with us into the archives of forgotten screams, where each story breathes again in the dust, the fire, and the bones of history. The year was 1884, and Ohio lay under winter's cruel hand, a land where frost clung to every window like the breath of a grave. The Johnson farmhouse stood alone against the storm, its roof bowed under the weight of snow, its chimney silent, lifeless. For weeks, neighbors had seen no movement, no lantern glow, no smoke rising to challenge the gray sky. They whispered of illness, of tragedy, but none dared to cross the farm's threshold until silence itself became unbearable. On the third week, driven by dread more than duty, a party of men pried open the door with numb fingers, splintering wood that resisted as though it too feared what lay inside. The first thing they noticed was the air. It was thick, stale, heavier than it should have been, as if the house had inhaled and never exhaled. Their boots creaked upon wooden boards stiff with ice, and in the parlor they found them. The Johnson family, 5 souls arranged not with violence, but with a stillness too deliberate to ignore. The father sat slumped in a chair, his jaw slack, his eyes frozen wide as though caught in mid-rebuke. The mother lay collapsed across the table, one arm stretched out as if reaching for a loaf of bread never baked. 3 children were scattered nearby, their forms stiff, their lips pale and cracked. It was not blood that marked them, nor wounds, but something unseen, as if breath itself had abandoned them in a single instant. Yet the youngest child unsettled them most. His body curled near the hearth, small hand clenched tightly around a scrap of paper charred by flame. The sheriff bent low, pried it loose with care, and found only a fragment, half-burnt words smeared by soot. He turned it in the light, but the writing dissolved into shadows. Still, the way the child's fingers had gripped it suggested something sacred, a final message, or perhaps a secret meant never to be lost. The men murmured of poison, of madness, of a pact sealed in death. But when they searched the doors and windows, they found each one locked from within, bolted tight as a coffin. The family had not fled, nor had an intruder forced his way in. Whatever had claimed them had entered by other means, through silence, through hunger, through memory itself. Outside, the snow pressed against the windows, muting every sound, while inside the house the air seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, as if the timbers groaned in remembrance of something older. One man swore he heard a faint humming, low and steady, like a child's voice drifting from the rafters. Another said it was only the wind, but his hands shook as he crossed himself. The sheriff, pale and hesitant, ordered the farmhouse sealed until the coroner could arrive. Yet even he could not silence the thought gnawing at every mind. What force could still 5 bodies without struggle, without cry, and leave behind only a burnt scrap in a child's hand? As the door was barred once more and the men trudged back through the snow, the farmhouse remained in shadow. And in that silence, behind bolted doors, the paper fragment seemed to smolder faintly, as if refusing to be extinguished. Something waited there, buried not in flesh but in memory, ready to rise. The story of the Johnson family did not begin with that frozen farmhouse in 1884. To understand their deaths, one had to walk backward through the corridors of time, through the fields and furrows of Ohio soil, to the roots that clung to their name like thorns. The Johnsons were farmers, yes, but before they tilled their own land, they had been tilled by it. Bent beneath its yoke, bodies once owned, their labor harvested as if they themselves were crops to be spent. Theirs was a lineage tangled in bondage, its scars hidden beneath calloused hands, its memories whispered only in hushed tones beneath the cover of night. The sheriff, uneasy in the farmhouse's silence, sent men to search the place further. In drawers lined with dust, they found scraps of letters, corners of journals, fragments of inked words scrawled in uneven hands. Some were the writings of a man who could barely spell, yet carried an urgency that bled through the page. One fragment spoke of songs carried on the wind, another of chains beneath the soil. On a wooden beam in the barn, half-rotted by time, they uncovered carvings, circles within circles, strange symbols foreign to their eyes. The sheriff declared them nonsense, but one of the older men in the search party muttered that he had seen such marks before, hidden in the cabins of those once enslaved. It was said that the Johnsons carried more than blood into their farmhouse. They carried voices. Their ancestors had sung songs forbidden by overseers, words of escape, of prayer, of defiance. These songs were not merely melodies, but maps, codes, and legacies passed from tongue to tongue when no paper was allowed. But in Ohio, far from the auction blocks and plantations, those whispers took on a different form. They were carved into wood, hidden in the folds of scripture, scribbled on scraps that looked meaningless to outsiders. To the Johnsons, they were memory given shape. To their neighbors, they were madness made visible. And so the question grew heavier. What had been in the child's burnt paper? Was it a hymn, a prayer, a secret handed down that the dead refused to release? Why had his hand clenched it so tightly that even death could not open his grip? Some said the farmhouse tragedy was punishment, not by man, but by the weight of memory itself. Others believed it was inheritance, the past refusing to stay buried, clawing through wood and frost alike to claim its debt. The sheriff, who prided himself on reason, found himself staring into the grain of the farmhouse beams, convinced he could almost hear a voice there, low and steady, humming through the wood. By the time the coroner arrived, suspicion had shifted. No longer did the town wonder only how the Johnsons died, but why. Why now, in 1884, did their legacy rise again, cold and unyielding? As the bodies lay stiff and silent, the air around them seemed charged, as though the whispers themselves demanded to be heard. And when the coroner reached to unfold the charred scrap once more, his hand froze. For though it was no longer a flame, he swore he felt a pulse beneath the ash, as if the fragment itself still breathed. Long before the Johnson family's farmhouse became a coffin in 1884, the land it stood upon had already tasted flame and ash. Neighbors still spoke of a night in the 1850s when the horizon burned red, not with harvest fires, but with punishment. The story was told in fragments, whispered from porch to porch, carried like a burden no one wished to claim. It began with a runaway, an unnamed man whose body bore the lash, whose feet left trails of blood across snow. He staggered toward the Johnson land, desperate, hollow-eyed, clutching a song more precious than any coin. It was said that when he reached their barn, he collapsed, whispering words in a language few could understand, yet heavy with prayer. The Johnsons gave him bread, water, and the mercy of silence. But hunters came swiftly, their dogs baying, their torches splitting the night. When they discovered the runaway hidden in the barn, they demanded his release. The Johnson patriarch, himself only one generation removed from slavery, refused. His refusal was not met with debate, but with fire. Torches hurled against timber, smoke devouring the air, screams rising with the embers. The runaway's voice carried one last time, a song torn by agony, rising above the crackle of wood and the roar of flame. When dawn came, the barn was nothing but blackened skeletons of beams. The runaway's body was never found, only bones scorched too badly to name, mingled with the ashes of hay and wood. The Johnsons rebuilt, but the land never forgot. The soil retained the stench of charred flesh. The wind, when passing through the new barn, carried the sound of faint humming, as if the song had lodged itself within the beams. By the time the sheriff's men searched the farmhouse in 1884, these stories had faded into superstition, told only by the oldest tongues. Yet as they unearthed diaries and letters, the fire's shadow returned. One fragment, written in a trembling hand, spoke of a song that refused to die. Another spoke of seeing the runaway's eyes in dreams, staring from the corners of the barn at night. It was then that the sheriff remembered the burnt scrap clutched in the child's hand. Could it have been part of that song, an heirloom passed from ashes to ink, preserved across decades until the boy's final breath? If so, then the deaths were not random nor madness. They were inheritance. Fire consumes, but it also preserves. The runaway's last cry had never been extinguished. The coroner, though skeptical, admitted one detail that unsettled him. The child's lips were stained black, as if ash had been placed upon his tongue. Was it ritual? Was it poison? Or was it remembrance, an act of binding between the living and the dead? No answer came, only silence. And in that silence, as night fell upon the empty farmhouse, the floorboards creaked in rhythm, as though footsteps echoed where no living soul walked. The fire that had once devoured the barn had left its mark upon the bloodline, and its flames smoldered still, unseen but unyielding. The Johnsons had not been alone in that farmhouse. They had been joined by a legacy too heavy to silence, a fire that demanded its song. And if the boy had carried it in his hand, then perhaps he had also carried it in his soul. The coroner closed his notes with trembling fingers, but before he could rise from the table, he heard it. A faint hum, low, steady, drifting from the hearth where the ashes lay cold. Hunger is a voice that gnaws without rest. It rattles bone, it weakens sinew, and it hollows the eyes until every glance is a prayer for sustenance. In the winters of the 1860s, when war raged across the nation and supplies grew scarce, the Johnson family endured nights where the cupboard was bare and the soil too frozen to yield. Their journals, discovered decades later in the dust of their ruined farmhouse, spoke of meals that consisted of nothing more than boiled roots or a crust of bread split among 5 mouths. But the entries grew stranger as the winter deepened. One described how hunger was not only in the body but in the very walls of the house, groaning, creaking, whispering. The father wrote of a knock at the door one night. 3 times it came, sharp against the wood, though when the door swung open, the yard lay barren, snow undisturbed except for a trail of footprints that dissolved before his eyes. The mother described waking to a sound in the rafters, a low murmuring, voices of kin long gone. She swore she heard the name of her own grandmother, a woman enslaved in Kentucky, her voice thin but insistent, "Remember us." Hunger in those nights became more than a sensation. It became a visitation. The family began to mark the walls with symbols, circles within circles, drawn by candlelight in the dead of night. The sheriff's men who saw them in 1884 dismissed them as madness, the ramblings of starved minds. But to those who understood, they were sigils of memory, an attempt to inscribe legacy where hunger threatened to erase it. In the hunger-carved nights, the Johnsons did not pray for bread alone. They prayed that their lineage would not vanish, that the fire of remembrance would outlast the gnawing void. Yet hunger makes bargains. It steals from the living to feed the past. In one journal fragment, the mother confessed that she feared their youngest had begun to see things no child should. He whispered to corners, as if speaking to unseen guests. He would go to the hearth and press his small hands against the cold ashes, as though searching for warmth that no fire provided. She feared hunger had hollowed him into a vessel, that the voices filling the house had found his body a place to rest. By the time the coroner examined the boy's corpse in 1884, his face was marked by a strange peace, unlike the rigid horror of the others. His clenched fist around the burnt scrap, his lips darkened with soot, seemed less like the touch of death and more like a ritual offering. Had he consumed the ash, or had it consumed him? The sheriff, unwilling to dwell, closed the journal and told his men to say nothing of the symbols, nothing of the voices. But silence cannot bury hunger. Hunger lingers, gnawing a ghost with teeth. And when the wind swept against the farmhouse that night, rattling the shutters like bones in a sack, the sound that echoed through the fields was not the storm, alone. It was the slow, steady rhythm of voices, murmuring through wood and frost alike, asking not for bread but for memory. The farmhouse had been fed, but what price had been paid and what debt still lingered, hollow and unfulfilled? Freedom came in the wake of war, but it was not the deliverance that had been promised. The chains had been struck off, yes, yet the Johnson family soon discovered that iron was not the only shackle. Shadows followed them, lingering at the edges of their fields, watching their every harvest with cold, unblinking eyes. They built their farmhouse in Ohio with hands cracked by labor, wood hammered into place as if each nail were a declaration that they belonged upon this soil. But freedom, to those around them, was an affront. Night became their enemy. Neighbors whispered of riders who moved beneath the cover of darkness, white-robed figures carrying torches like serpents of fire, hissing across the countryside. One night in 1872, the Johnson patriarch wrote of a shadow that lingered outside the farmhouse door for hours. He watched it from within, the lamp quivering in his hand, but the figure never moved, never knocked. It stood in silence as though listening to the very breath of the house. When dawn came, the snow bore no prints, and the ground seemed undisturbed, as though the shadow had seeped into the earth itself. Children began to speak of figures crouched by their beds at night, whispering in tones too faint to understand. One girl woke screaming, claiming a man with no face leaned close enough that she felt his cold breath upon her cheek. The mother dismissed it as nightmares, yet she too had begun to feel watched, her prayers broken by the sense of eyes upon her even in daylight. In 1884, when the sheriff found the Johnsons sealed inside their home, the memory of those shadows returned with force. He recalled stories of men dragged from homes in the dead of night, their bodies strung from trees as warnings. Yet here there were no broken locks, no signs of struggle. Instead, it was as if the shadows had seeped through the very walls, closing in until the family's final breaths had been smothered in silence. Among the journals found in the wreckage was one that chilled the sheriff most. The mother had written, "They come not only for flesh, but for what we carry. They whisper of debts unpaid, of voices unsung. They say we have taken what should have burned with the fire, and they demand its return." Was this paranoia born of fear or confession of something deeper? What was it the Johnsons carried? Scraps of song, fragments of bone, or an inheritance that refused to die? The sheriff's men, hardened by violence, avoided the subject, yet none would linger at the farmhouse door past dusk. For as the coroner prepared the bodies for burial, the door creaked upon its hinges, though no wind stirred outside. And in that moment every man present swore they saw it, a shadow, thin and tall, standing just beyond the threshold. It did not move. It did not enter. It simply waited as if patient for the moment when silence would once more fill the house. The sheriff slammed the door shut, but the damage was done. Shadows do not depart. They cling, they linger, and they return. And in 1884, the Johnson family learned that some doors, once opened, never close again. The ruin of the Johnson farmhouse yielded more than journals and scraps of charred paper. Beneath the rotting floorboards, in a cavity dark and airless, the sheriff's men uncovered what should never have been disturbed: bones. They were small, brittle, blackened by fire and time, wrapped in fragments of cloth as though carefully hidden, not discarded. At first glance, they were thought to belong to an animal, perhaps some offering buried long ago. But closer inspection silenced the room. These were human, and not the bones of grown men or women. They were the bones of the small and fragile, infants or children whose cries had been stilled before their voices could ever grow strong. The coroner, pale with unease, turned the remains in trembling hands. Some bore scorch marks, as if they had once passed through fire. Others were clean, untouched by flame, but worn by years of burial in earth beneath wooden boards. He ordered silence among the men, swearing them to secrecy, yet the weight of the discovery pressed heavy on their tongues. By nightfall, the whispers had spread. The Johnsons had harbored more than memories within their home. Neighbors began to speculate wildly. Some said these were the bones of the runaway who had burned in their barn decades earlier, gathered and hidden, so that his spirit might never be desecrated by hostile hands. Others claimed they were sacrifices, infants given to silence in some ritual too dreadful to name. A few, remembering the family's strange symbols and nocturnal hymns, muttered that the Johnsons had trafficked not only in memory, but in forbidden rites, binding themselves to voices of the past with bone and ash as tokens. The sheriff tried to quiet the rumors, insisting the bones were relics of a tragedy long forgotten. Yet even he could not shake the feeling that the air around the farmhouse thickened in their presence. It was as though the bones themselves carried weight, a silence that suffocated every room they were carried into. One deputy dropped them in fright when he thought he heard a faint rattle, like teeth chattering, though no breath stirred the air. The burial of the remains was done in haste. No coffin, no marker, only earth heaped quickly over a shallow pit at the edge of the field. The sheriff ordered it so, hoping secrecy would prevent unrest. But the ground remembers. The soil, heavy with frost, seemed to resist swallowing the bones, as though rejecting their concealment. Men left the burial site pale, their mouths sealed, yet their eyes betrayed them. When news reached the town, doors were barred at dusk. Mothers clutched their children tighter, whispering prayers against silence that pressed too close. And those who had once pitied the Johnson family began to speak of curses, of debts unpaid, of a household that had carried too much of the dead within its walls. The farmhouse remained locked, the bodies of the Johnsons prepared for burial, yet every man who stepped within swore that in the stillness of night, the boards beneath their boots creaked, not as wood, but as bones stirring beneath their weight. The silence of the bones was heavier than screams, and silence, when it lingers too long, becomes prophecy. When spring thawed the Ohio fields in 1885, the Johnson farmhouse no longer seemed a home. Its windows, once bright with lamplight, stood hollow, shattered by winter storms. The boards split and buckled, sagging beneath the weight of neglect, as though the very bones of the house sought to collapse upon themselves. No family claimed it, no neighbor dared approach it after dusk. The land became a place children hurried past, whispering of voices that hummed when the wind rattled through the broken rafters. By the decade's end, the farmhouse had become ruin. Vines climbed its skeleton walls, ivy curling like veins around the brittle wood. Rain rotted the roof until the sky peered through its open wounds. Yet even in ruin, the house seemed alive, breathing with memory. Travelers swore they heard steps pacing the upper floor, though no boards remained to support them. Others said they saw smoke drift faintly from the chimney on nights when storms rolled in, though no fire burned within. The ruin carried its own pulse, steady and unrelenting, as if the family's final breath still lingered in the timber. Fragments of their lives surfaced like artifacts from a burial mound.